Welcome to the show. From Peterson's, I'm your host, Taylor Sienkiewicz, and you're listening to You Have a Cool Job, a podcast highlighting those who took their profession in a unique direction and what they did to get there. On today's episode of You Have a Cool Job, we talked to Jake Urban. Jake was on his way up the mountain as he works with a very specific force of nature, avalanches. Jake owns and operates his company, the Jackson Hole Outdoor Leadership Institute, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He explained what exactly the company does.
We provide avalanche education at the recreational level, and then we also provide pre-hospital medicine, both urban and wilderness protocol.
As a professional avalanche educator, as well as an instructor trainer for avalanche education, he works in what you may think of as a very specific field, but he explains the multiple ways in which he uses his expertise.
I've been a lifelong educator, and then I've also been an emergency responder for the last 23 years. In the last 10, I spent with Teton County Search and Rescue as Deputy Director and Training Advisor. And then I've just most recently retired from emergency services.
Great. And let's start with then that instructing that you do, like those courses. What does that look like? And what are those courses preparing people for?
So ultimately, all of our courses focus ultimately on trying to help people make better decisions in the backcountry. And from the avalanche standpoint, the biggest thing we're trying to help folks understand is what type of terrain is capable of avalanching, and then ultimately trying to help them understand what type of conditions those terrain features are most likely to avalanche in.
Okay. And so who are usually taking those courses? Is it people who are backcountry skiing, or are you kind of teaching ski patrol, or what's your demographic of people?
So the folks that we see taking our avalanche courses specifically, we see a good range of recreationalists and then aspiring professionals. And so at the recreational community, we're teaching level 1s, level 2s, avalanche rescue. And that's also the beginning point for the professional continuum.
Jake went on to explain that recreational learners are taught basic skills in avalanche rescue, while the professionals start there learning advanced skills for safety, search, and rescue. These professionals include ski patrollers, avalanche forecasters, ski guides, and mountain guides. While it's obvious that these people would need to learn avalanche safety, I wanted to learn more about the importance of this training. Jake, why are these courses so important then for these types of people?
These courses are simply part of a continuum. And I think that's really important for folks to recognize in regards to education. Because education hurts a little bit. It doesn't feel good. You're normally being taught things that you don't know, and then being able to apply the techniques and the theories that we teach, takes a significant amount of time. So it's one piece of learning within the process of trying to ultimately keep yourself alive in backcountry terrain, and then more importantly, having that graduated approach. And so I would argue that we teach culture. We're ultimately trying to teach people what that progression looks like, how long it takes people to get from point A to point B, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, and what about, are they mostly in the field courses then?
So the avalanche courses are broken up between classroom and field, and so there's a 60-40 split, 40% in the classroom and then 60% of the time is in the field. And those courses range from, on the recreational level, from 3 to 4 days.
Got it. And then when you're in the field, what are you just learning how to use the gear, or what are you doing outside?
Well, it's all across the board from the standpoint that we ultimately meet students where they are. Some students have very good orientation with their equipment. Other folks, it's the first time they've really been using their equipment. And so it's a wide range, especially at the level 1. there is equipment orientation, and then there's the whole process of actually traveling in the terrain and being able to identify different terrain features, and then ultimately understand how the character of avalanche problems lies within those terrain features. In regards to the education that happens in the classroom, there's a combination of a little bit of science from the phenomenon standpoint, being able to interpret the bulletin, and then ultimately being oriented to the different types of avalanche problems that we manage in the field.
I then asked Jake about his search and rescue experience and the application of his educational avalanche safety knowledge.
The easiest way to explain it is that it was a culmination of all of my skills throughout my entire career that allowed me to perform medical leadership, hazard recognition, risk management, managing people, and specifically managing people in terrain around hazards that have injured someone or killed somebody in the field, and then we're going in afterwards. So it's like I said, it's a combination of life skills, throughout several decades of a career, and then amassing them into that rescue package.
Jake has 25 years of experience in the industry, so I was curious about where this industry has taken him over time. He explained where he started and how he came to where he is now.
Interestingly enough, I started in southwestern Pennsylvania and ended up in South Florida for college for audio and video production. And that process was actually instrumental in terms of changing my trajectory, because I was a musician. I ended up in South Florida, and I quickly realized that I did not like a single season, and I missed the 4 seasons, and I ended up, I finished audio and video production school and ended up in Vermont. Back at school, went to Linden State College for recreation resource management, and upon graduating from that program, I ended up teaching there on campus for 11 years, and so my background is steeped in education from teaching undergraduate, but I've been teaching folks from age 8 to 80. I've taught grade school, high school, but primarily at the college level. And during that time, I was teaching outdoor education, so I was a skills instructor teaching things like backcountry skiing, rock climbing, navigation, doing extended wilderness courses with students throughout the world, South America, into Canada, and then ultimately I left Vermont, and then for the last 12 years I've been in Jackson Hole, and shortly after I got to Jackson, opened up the Leadership Institute, and we're coming into our 10th year now.
Jake explained that he decided to follow this trajectory because of a lack he saw in the snowsports and backcountry industry.
In the avalanche education world, the one thing that I felt we were missing was educators, classically trained educators. Mm-hmm. And not to say that the industry wasn't doing a good job with the practitioners that we had, but they were primarily guides, and we have good educators with guides, but that's also not, and at that time wasn't their primary function. And so since then, there's been a significant trend in avalanche education where we're seeing more traditional educators come into it, and guides really opening up their educational spectrum in order to take on things like teacher training or continued professional development, where they can continue to work on their teaching skills. At the end of the day, that's really what we're coming down to, is this piece where we're communicating with people and expecting people to communicate back. So, as I said, avalanche education has this big science piece to it, but at the end of the day, it's really how we talk with one another and how we communicate in the field that keeps people out of trouble.
Yeah. What is that
that science piece? I haven't thought of that before.
Well, the science piece is ultimately this game of you're basically tipping a scale. How much weight can be applied to a snowpack that it's capable of adjusting to that load? And then you put things like gravity into the mix because we put it on a slope angle. And then we have friction coefficient. And we have compressive forces. So for instance, we create a compressive force, a downward force on the snowpack when we engage with it. And if we have the failure of a weak layer, we create a crack. That tensile crack occurs, and then we have a shear release. And so ultimately, we're talking about structural engineering. And that's really the approach that I like to take with it is that we're structural engineers. And we want to build a snowpack like you would build a house. We want it to last. We want to have a strong foundation, and we want to build it from the bottom up. And so I like to think of snow as a structural material because it changes based on temperature and moisture content, relative humidity.
Jake said that the psychology aspect of avalanche training is to teach people to be okay with backing off and even leaving when they get to an area where certain hazards are present. He explained that people who go through this training still need to be conscious of the fact that they still have a lot to learn and to not take unnecessary risks.
You come into education, you kind of get frightened because there's a lot of things that you don't know about. And then as you begin to apply them, you begin to think that you know more than you do. And then a lot of people get caught. And sometimes that's a near miss, sometimes that's an injury, and sometimes that's a fatality. But these lessons are incredibly hard in this terrain. It's completely unforgiving. And so sometimes folks get lucky and they get away with a bad decision. But those are the times things can go wrong. So these cognitive biases that we have about what we think and what we know are often incomplete because of the lack of experience that's necessary in order to gain a holistic understanding of how that terrain acts and how that snowpack is going to react to your additional load on it as a skier or snowmobiler, etc.
Yeah. And Jake, as for a little bit more general, what is something that is surprising about your job? Like, what types of questions do people ask you when you tell them that you teach AVS courses?
Within my community, it's not very surprising. I fit in pretty naturally. When I leave the mountain community, it's completely foreign. People think of it oftentimes as risk takers or extreme sports, and at the end of the day, that's not really the case. It's really a bunch of hippies going out, trying to ski some powder and enjoy some time with one another, and engage in the outdoors with friends. And so culture changes, throughout our country significantly. So genuinely, folks that don't understand what I'm doing are genuinely interested to try to understand it a little bit better. At the end of the day, what I really like to remind folks is that I work in a really unique environment that is beautiful and incredibly rewarding. I've worked very, very hard to make that possible, and I think the one thing I like to dispel is that my job is easy because it's far from it. I'm managing a tremendous amount of risk in hazardous terrain with varying skills and abilities and trying to meet educational outcomes. It's still work at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. And what what are those parts that are so rewarding to you?
The engagement with people. The greatest thing about being a teacher is seeing the aha when folks get it. And then more importantly, the thing that's most rewarding is when I can communicate the process and then model that regards to how I manage terrain, and then to see that culture spread. And that's really what the Leadership Institute is about, is spreading the cultures of safety.
Yeah. And Jake, what is your field looking like from a job perspective on, is it growing? Are a lot of people getting into it? How have you seen that trend over your experience with it?
It's been growing exponentially, and there's been a lot of people coming into the industry because of the growth of backcountry skiing. And with that, there's been a bigger demand for avalanche courses. So there's a tremendous amount of people coming into. My trepidation with that is simply that, again, it's a process. I know when I came into it, I can look back at my own progression and recognize some significant limitations in my own teaching. And so while it's a good thing that we're filling the need, at the same time, progression that's necessary for folks to engage with avalanche terrain, that same progression is necessary in terms of professionals coming into it. It's a long haul, and for myself, being an outdoor educator, I never would have made a career out of just teaching avalanche courses. And so there needs to be a significant diversity within that, within the industry, and then a significant amount of other skills that come into it. So guide training, outdoor education, avalanche education, leadership training, etc.
Jake Urban works in a niche industry that is becoming more and more popular with a growing interest in backcountry skiing, snowboarding, and snowmobiling. Niches like these, where people see a need and find a way to fill it, is how many people are able to combine their career with their own interests and hobbies. We hope you're inspired by Jake's story to find your niche. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.